Your hand is on the trolling motor. You haven't pushed it yet, but you've already decided. The screen is showing fish, there's bait down there, the water looks exactly the way it's supposed to look, and you've made 15 casts without a touch. So you're going to go find some more fish. That's the plan. That's always the plan. Leave your hand where it is for a few minutes. There are 12 things you can change before that motor comes on. Most of us never work through more than 4, and almost all of them are free. Underneath all 12, there are only 4 questions. Where exactly are they? Whether they're eating, what you're actually offering, and what they already know about you. One standing note first. Seasons, limits, legal methods, and bait rules change by state and often lake to lake. Check your state and local regulations before you go, every time. So, number 1. You did not fish this spot. You put a good cast into the middle of the laydown, nothing happened, and in your head that tree is checked off. But that tree isn't one place, it's 3. There's where the trunk crosses the grass line, where the bank quits and the water starts. There's the tangle where the big limbs split, usually the only real shade on that wood. And there's the tip out in deeper water, a completely different neighborhood from the other 2. Same tree, 3 addresses, and the fish do not care which one looks prettier to you. So before your hand touches that motor, 3 more casts, 1 to each. And when something bumps you or follows, don't remember the tree, remember where you were looking, and line it up with something on the bank behind it. 3 of those and you don't have a spot anymore, you have an address. Number 2 is about which half of that structure has been getting your casts. Almost everybody fishes the comfortable side, out of the wind, where the boat sits still, where you can see your line. That's a human decision, not a fishing one. Food moves in a lake, and it doesn't move at random, it gets pushed. Wind works the surface drags the small stuff along, and after enough hours it piles up on one end. Baitfish follow it, and whatever eats baitfish sets up where that pile ends up. I used to be more skeptical of the old windward shore rule than I am now. There's better freshwater evidence for part of it than I first realized. But here's what most anglers miss. It's slow. It takes hours of steady wind to build, sometimes more than a day. So the question isn't whether it's windy right now, it's how long the wind has been coming from that direction. So take that same piece of cover, 6 casts to the wind side, 6 to the other, same lure. If one gives you a follow and the other gives you nothing, you just cut your work in half for the day. Number 3, look at the water again, or at your screen. We've all been taught to hunt for the fish. Big arcs, hard returns, the stack of marks that makes you stop the boat. But those marks are the end of the story. The food is the beginning of it. And bait tells you more by how it's arranged than by whether it's there. A tight ball with clean edges, sitting still, nobody bothering it, that's a school nothing is hunting. Looks fantastic on a screen. Usually isn't. What you want is loose bait. Strung out, ragged, a few off on their own. That mess is evidence. So here's the change. If your marks are sitting there like furniture, but there's torn up bait 40 yards away, go to the bait. Not another lake. Not another point. 40 yards, inside the spot you were about to quit on. Number 4 is the part everybody does, so we'll do it fast. Run the lure above them, then through them, then under them. Then burn it, then crawl it. Then swim it straight, then break the rhythm up so it stalls and starts. Then move 30 feet and come at the same water from a different direction. That's the whole presentation checklist. But if none of those 4 gets you even a reaction, and I mean a reaction, not a bite, stop assuming another retrieve tweak is going to save you. And this is where most anglers make the wrong decision. Because here's a question almost nobody asks. Are those fish even open for business? Imagine knowing exactly where 9 big bass were, every hour, for a whole year. Researchers at Auburn put radio tags in 9 largemouth in a Georgia reservoir and followed them through 4 seasons. Most of the time, those fish barely moved. Through the middle of the day, they sat in deeper water, tight to big wood, and stayed put. As the light went, they slid shallower. So that fish on your screen at noon, buried in the deep timber, isn't missing. It isn't stupid. And your lure isn't necessarily wrong. You might simply be fishing its bedroom, which changes what you do next. You stop trying to wake something up and start looking for where it goes when it wakes on its own. There's a bedroom, a dining room, and a road in between. So don't spend another 40 minutes forcing those deep fish. Find the shortest line between that deep wood and the nearest shallow feeding edge, and fish the road. If it's flat noon with nothing moving, mark that road and be standing on it when the light drops. Quick way to tell which kind you're looking at. Fish sitting hard on the bottom, ignoring everything, quiet bait around them. Those are resting. Fish that lift off the bottom even a couple of feet, or bait that keeps getting scattered nearby. Those are open. Say they're open. They're up in the water, the bait's getting pushed around, and they still won't eat. Now we go to work on what you're offering. And the first change isn't the lure. It's the direction the lure travels. Think about a dock post, a standing stump, a bluff wall. A fish sitting against something vertical is very often set up to take something falling past it. And you've been swimming baits horizontally by that fish all morning. Same lure. Just drop it. Straight down the post, line pinched between your fingers, watching for the tick that says it stopped falling early. 3 vertical falls beside anything standing up before you call it empty. Number 6. Size. You already looked at the bait back in step 3, so don't guess. Short, thick forage and a long, slender bait is the wrong silhouette no matter what color it is. Thin, small forage, go down, and go down further than feels comfortable. If you never got a look at the forage, skip this one. Guessing about profile is changing colors with extra steps. Number 7 is the difference between a bait that works and the exact same bait that doesn't. Everybody knows a lighter weight falls slower. That's not the useful part. A slow-falling bait doesn't just take longer. It drifts. Cast at a stump, let it fall on a light weight, and by the time it reaches the fish, it may be 4 or 5 feet off that wood, out in open water, past the only thing that mattered. Add weight and it stays vertical. It lands where you aimed. So a lot of what gets filed under "they didn't want it falling slow" is really a bait that quietly left the building on the way down. Test it right now. Drop the same bait twice, light and heavy. Count out loud until it hits, but watch where it ends up, not just how long it took. Number 8. Noise. And the instinct here is almost always wrong. You've been throwing something with a rattle. It isn't working, so you reach for a different rattle. Different color, same sound, same everything that matters to a fish that isn't looking at the paint. Fish in hard-worked water hear the same handful of signals over and over. And what the research points at is that the thing which really changes a fish's behavior is getting caught itself. The fish that gets hooked is the one that turns cautious. So the change isn't louder, it's different. 15 casts of thump and rattle, and the next one should make almost no sound at all. Feast quietly all morning with nothing. Put something loud through and see if anything wakes up. Louder or quieter, just not the same thing again in a new color. Number 9 is the most useful thing in this whole video. At this point, most anglers finally reach for another lure. Don't. Look 4 inches in front of the one you already have tied on. Your knot, your snap, your split ring, the wire gauge in your hooks, your leader. That hardware isn't a detail, it's the suspension on the whole thing. Put a heavier hook on a bait and you'll drop its nose, so it sits differently the moment you stop reeling. And that stopped moment is exactly when a fish makes up its mind. Tie straight to a stiff leader with a tight knot, and you can strangle the action. Take the wobble the designer built in and turn it into a stick swimming through the water. Here's the test, and I'd really like you to do this one. Hold your lure just under the surface at your feet. Pull it a few inches, then stop. Watch what it does when it stops. That's the exact picture a fish gets in the half second it decides, and almost nobody has ever looked at it. Then change one piece, a loop knot instead of a tight one. One size lighter in the hooks. Watch it again. Nobody's running a spring marketing campaign for a split ring, which is a fair part of why you've never been told this. 2 left. Number 10 happens before the lure gets there. We've all watched a fish follow in and turn off at the boat. Easy to read that as the lure being wrong. Often it isn't. It's the splash landing on top of the fish, the line cutting the water above it, the hull, your shadow. So back off. Cast longer than you need to, land it well past the target, and let the bait swim in from clean water. A lot of they quit biting spots are really I got too close 20 minutes ago. Which brings me to the last one, and it's the strangest. There's a lake in Illinois where they didn't guess about any of this. Fishing was completely controlled. Anglers booked their time. Every fish caught was measured, tagged, written down, and released. Every single capture, on the record. And then, after 4 years, they drained the lake. All of it. So they could account for every fish that had been in there the whole time. Here's what they found. Some fish had been caught over and over. One was caught 16 times in a single year, and a real share of that population had been living in the same water the entire time, right past all those anglers, and had never been caught once. Sit with that. The fish in that lake were not the same as each other. Some were easy, some were close to impossible, and every one of them looked identical. So think about what that means for the water you're on right now. The fish didn't leave. The easy ones may simply have been caught already. This morning, yesterday, by you an hour ago. What's left may be the difficult end of that population, and no color in your box fixes that. But here's the good news, and it's why this is a change and not an excuse. It wears off. Fish that get hard to catch tend to get catchable again once the pressure comes off. So the change is this: leave. Not the lake, the target. Go work your second best piece of water for half an hour. Then come back, and come back different. Another angle, a different sound, a different line through the same water. Sometimes the best change you can make is to stop showing that fish the same thing. And now we're back where we started. Hand on the trolling motor. Except this time there are 4 questions to run before you push it. Have I put the bait through the small piece of water that could hold a feeding fish? Is there any sign these fish are open for business? Have I changed what I'm offering? The fall, the direction, the sound, the hardware, or did I just change color? And how many times have I shown them the same thing from the same place? If any of those is unanswered, stay. If all 4 are clean but you're seeing feeding signs, rest it and come back differently. If all 4 are clean with no sign of feeding anywhere, go. But go knowing why. That's the difference. Moving because you're frustrated teaches you nothing. Moving because you worked the list and it came back empty is a diagnosis. Same note on the rules. Licenses, seasons, limits, legal methods, and the rules on live bait and moving fish between waters vary by state and often by the lake. Check your state and local regulations before you fish. If you can't confidently identify what you're holding, put it back. Now I want to hear from you. And I'd rather have the argument than the agreement. Here's my position. I think most days written off as they weren't biting were really spots where the easy fish had already been caught, and we spent the afternoon casting at the difficult ones. Tell me where that falls apart on your water. Then give me one specific thing. Think about the last spot you left. What was the actual reason your hand went to that motor? Was it evidence, or 20 minutes of nothing and a feeling? Here's the thing about leaving. You never find out what was going to happen on the next cast. That water doesn't send you a report. You drive home, and the spot keeps whatever it was holding. So these 12 aren't 12 tricks. They're 12 ways of making the water answer you before you walk away from it. Your hand is on the trolling motor. It's fine to push it. Just make sure you're leaving with an answer, and not only with a feeling.